Well, good morning. It's very nice indeed to be here. I have the many pleasures in life. One of them at the moment is to work across one of the most beautiful parts of the country, work across the east of England and East London, which I have to say, for those of you not blessed to live in those parts of the country, come and live there. It's the place where everything's happening. We had an amazing event last week where we talked about Miracle in the East, which is really a symbol of how we see the ambition across that region. Had the pleasure of working with Ty back in the last millennium in Education Action Zone in Lambeth, and was reflecting last night on some of the successes. One of the greatest successes was there are 2 secondary schools in that area covered by that action zone, and while I worked in the area, this is back in 99, 2000, both of the secondary schools, neither doing terribly well at the time, both appointed new head teachers. Both were, I would say, quite edgy appointments, brave appointments, interesting people. One of the real tests of that time is that both of them are still in place. Both of them have led their schools to be both wonderful schools, and are now schools where across London people look to those schools to be how you do improvement for children right across the social stratas, particularly for those most disadvantaged. And I start with that in terms of shaping the school system. As the Secretary of State said, what the government sees is in terms of shaping the school system, is that the school system is to be led by those who know best how to lead schools. And what we have set out in the government's white paper is a vision of a school system that will build on the developments in the last few years and reach quite an ambitious and different place in the next few years. And so what I want to just show you very briefly in some slides is where we are now, where we're aiming to get to, how we might get there, and what some of the key support for getting there might encompass. So in terms of where we are now, in terms of the academy system, much more academised in the secondary sector than in the primary sector, those kind of numbers across the school system, out of a bit more than 20,000 schools, just over 5,000, nearly 6,000 schools now become academies. Studio schools, university technical colleges. On the right-hand side, however, is the bit I want to focus on. These are the people leading the school system, either as sponsors, trusts taking on schools that need support in driving up standards, multi-academy trust, nearly 1,000. Trusts of schools coming together to work together to get the very best from how they rub each other off and get the best from across what they're doing. Teaching schools, national leaders of education, national leaders of governance. In terms of those 973 multi-academy trusts, the bottom bullet points are the kind of trusts many people have heard of. Some famous, well-known, highly ambitious trusts that are doing some really fantastic things across the country. However, as you can see, the vast majority of multi-academy trusts are in the much smaller size of 5 or less schools. And the big job over the next few years, we move to a time when the multi-academy trust will be the significant unit in our education system, in overseeing, supporting, driving improvement across the system. And what we're going to see in the next few years is not only new multi-academy trusts set up, more people emulating what these pioneers have done, but also these trusts significantly looking for growth and development. So what are we going to look like? So we've sort of set 2022 without being a particular target or a year to absolutely aim for, but sort of saying how far will the school system get in 2022? And Ty showed that very good clip of my boss, Sir David, in his role as National Schools Commissioner, talking about the school system. And some of you will have had the opportunity in the last few weeks to go to some of the roadshows he's doing around across the country. One of the key things he's saying is that every school is a giver and receiver of support. There'll be schools where performance puts them more in the category of needing to be part of something to support them, and there'll be those whose performance leads them to be seen as a bit more the drivers of the leadership. However, all of us who've worked with schools, those that are seen as the better schools and those more struggling schools know that within every school, there's that bit of the school which you die for in order to really try to share some of that practice. I'm going to talk in a moment about some of the growth going on in the sector, and what we're really keen to see is that those who are involved in trying to judge which trusts are ready for growth, which still have more work to do before they do, that it is those in the school system, those who understand the multi-academy trust system, who are the people who should be involved and making those decisions. That they should be really looking to see, how do we not just reinvent the wheel? How do we, in terms of some of the colleagues here today, make sure we learn from some of the pioneers in terms of what they have learned in terms of making trusts effective? Governance, as you know, is probably the biggest revolution going on in our school system in terms of what we expect of governance. And I've come this morning from a breakfast of academy ambassadors, people who are coming into our trust system who've not previously been involved in school governance, but are offering their time and expertise to assist growing organisations get both the money and the performance right in terms of going forward. But crucially, this is about not just changing the school structures for the point of changing school structures, but in order to make, as Ty said, referred to Nicola Sturgeon's comments, that actually that performance gap is changed. Actually, this is about equity for children. Across the eastern region, as I said, it's one of the most beautiful parts of the country. It has the most fantastic schools, but overall, far too many children have the misfortune to live in the wrong place, particularly if they're from a less advantaged background. And their performance has been, for a long period of time, had nothing like the opportunity, for instance now, if they'd gone to school in a London school. So in terms of going forward to the next step, the crucial bit for us in terms of going from the picture I painted a moment or two ago of the 973 trusts is how we see growth of trusts. Now, all of you will know multi-academy trusts that are doing really well and those that need a bit more time to really get themselves into a good place. And we see these 4 different kinds of trusts. And the vast majority of trusts, as you saw from earlier on, are in that first box. They're start-up organisations. They're getting going. They're finding out how to make sense of this world. And what we want to do is to make sure we give a really good process to assess in a formative way what it is trusts have to do to put in place in order to grow, to become an established trust. And for some of those to go on and become regional or system trusts. And at each of those stages, there'd be a process that is a formative, supportive process that helps people work out what is that next stage of their development, that takes them from having been a successful organisation to a further successful organisation where more children get the opportunity that those already in that trust have had the good fortune already to experience. In terms of support for the system, academy trusts are accountable. They take on the responsibility for the schools in their trust. Ofsted inspect. Ofsted give that reality check where the children are getting what they should get and report on what they're doing. Our job, and we have a wonderful job working across each of the regions, as you know, is to particularly have a focus on those schools that are not doing well enough. To let academy trusts that are doing well fly, do what they know best, run the schools in the way that they understand. And our role is to pick up and to address schools, both maintained schools and academies, where performance is not good enough. The National College, through the Teaching Schools Council, through other people prepared to support the system, are there to provide both the pipeline of teachers, but also the system capacity that Ty referred to before. And crucially, I worked for a long time before I came into this role in local authorities. And what the white paper says is that there are some roles that local authorities will no longer do. Over the next few years, they will move out of the role in terms of school improvement, because multi-academy trusts will take on that role. However, local authorities will continue to be a key partner in the education infrastructure in the country by making sure there are places for children, making sure they're there to oversee safeguarding, assess children's special educational needs, oversee the admission system, make sure there are transport in those particular parts of the region I work in that ensure children can get to the schools they need to do. Last slide I want to show you comes back to what the Secretary of State was saying, which talks about educational excellence everywhere. And it's tough for everybody. Maintaining standards in every part of the country keeps everyone awake in terms of their schools. However, for some parts of the country, it's even tougher. And those of you who've read the white paper will recognise the slide that brings together both educational performance and the access of schools to system leader support. And the paler the part of the map, the better the educational performance, the better the availability of support. The darker the shading, the more tricky the situation is. And this map, of course, was giving hints towards what the Secretary of State was saying was come shortly, which will be the announcement of these achieving excellence areas, to give real priority over and above to those parts of the country that really need support. And Ty challenged her on how would they be led. And I think what she said to you was that they would reflect the particular needs of the different parts of the country that they serve. So I'm delighted to be here. In terms of shaping the school system, I suppose the most important thing I want to say is that there's masses of work to do. There's a huge development job to do. The leadership, as the Secretary of State said, the key role of the MAT CEO is clearly a really important role. However, in terms of reshaping that system, it will only have been worthwhile if at the end of changing that system, we have standards that are yet higher, and in particular, those children at the moment who come from the least advantaged backgrounds see their opportunities significantly enhanced. Thank you very much.
Tim, thank you. Come and join me. So can I ask our panel to come and join us? Lesley, welcome. Martyn. Also, just to share apologies from Hamid Patel. It was a difficult decision. Today is Eid, and Hamid wanted to spend this important celebration with his family. So he sends his apologies to you. I'm joined by a fantastic bunch of... Can you have a bunch of leaders? I suppose you can. Tim, have you got enough scaffolding there then? NLEs, National Leaders for Governance. Have you got what you need?
We've got it, but it's patchy and it's not in the right places. And so one of the most interesting things we're doing at the moment is seeing where there is a surfeit of support, how can we try to get that matched up with where it is much more tricky. So some of those dark blue areas on that map, one of the most important things we're trying to do at the moment is how we match up people who are prepared to go beyond just their immediate area. In particular, we're looking at trusts in London that would like to do more to sponsor, and there's not enough work for them, and their extent to which they're prepared to go outside London. We've now got a number of examples where that's happening, but it's early days.
And in terms of the future, I mean, it's part of your job. Are you like that character from Jungle Book? You know, you go, look in my eyes, small trust. I'm not saying you hiss, clearly, but you kind of look in the eyes of the smaller trusts and say, don't you want to grow? Don't you want to grow? And they go, no. Guess what? I'm really happy being a small, perfectly formed. I know everybody in my trust. I mean, part of the issue was stretch, and maybe Martyn's got a comment about this, but part of the issue in the early days was that you'd have a trust with schools everywhere. It was crackers. It's not a question there, is there?
Do we look into the eyes of trust? Yes, we do. And we need to get the best people to have an ambition to go beyond what they've previously done. And I think the great thing that I've observed in the 2 years of doing this work is to meet people who've ventured out into the unknown and done some of those things that you've talked about and made a success of it. And it's that we want to help people learn from. So I've used the word pioneer several times. We have got a number of pioneers, of people who've been brave enough to step outside that comfort zone. And we do need people to be prepared to step outside that comfort zone if we're to see their success replicated more widely.
Lesley, welcome. It's a long way from where you're from. Tell us to here. Maybe that's an issue in terms of policy making as well. Tell us a little bit about you, your work, Shotton Hall, the North East.
Yeah, certainly. Shotton Hall is a school that's rural, white British, coastal, about 50% free school meals. So we have a lot of those ticks in the boxes that tend to indicate low achievement, underachievement, and poor outcomes for young people. Nevertheless, like many other schools in the North East, and some of the people who are in the room today, we have managed to buck that trend. And I think one of the challenges for the North East is to take the pockets of excellence that exist within the region and that are certainly there, and there are many of them, and make sure that that sharing of expertise and resources is spread across the North East in a more timely manner. And I think, Ty, some of that has come back to the changes that have taken place over the last 5 or 6 years. I think as a school leader, it's certainly been an interesting time, and that's probably an understatement. There's been massive, massive change in the system. And to some extent, a sense of a feeling of flux, people making different choices and decisions for their schools depending on their situations. And certainly in the North East, some of that change has come later and more slowly than in other regions of the country. But I do feel now that there is a bigger sense of direction, that people have a sense of what we're moving towards and where we want to be. And I think a lot more people are thinking about, where do I want my school to be? How am I going to improve the outcomes for my young people? And how am I going to get there? And I think there's a lot more organic growth going on now between trusts, and that's about confidence. And I think confidence comes from the sharing of expertise. And I think the openness of trust to work with one another is a massive feature of that system as it matures. And that is building confidence. We are a relatively small trust. Knowing that because we are predominantly secondary, that I can go and find help and expertise from trusts that are predominantly primary for working with our primary schools is a massive boost for me in terms of expanding our trust into the primary sector. It's also economies of scale. It's also really very sensible. And I think that building up of trust between trusts, so to speak, is an important precursor, because if we're really going to improve schools, if we're really going to get to the nub of the issue, we've really got to get behind the drawbridge. Quite often schools who are finding themselves in a challenging position, they close the doors, they pull up the drawbridge, they feel sensitive and unhappy, and they feel under attack, when actually we need the very opposite. We need the doors wide open for as much help and support as possible. The other thing I would say is I think the RSC role, we're finally starting to get some alignment between the side of the education system that identifies the issues. So I work as an Ofsted inspector, that's one of my roles. The DFE have their own way of identifying schools who they think are struggling. And then we have teaching schools in the National College and all the school improvement side of the sector. School improvement is carried out by the practitioners in the end, in reality. And we're starting to get, I think, some alignment between those who identify the issues and those who actually will help bring change and better outcomes for those young people. And I think that's a really important development within the system itself.
Did you feel like a lonely pioneer in the early days?
Yes, quite. A colleague told me they watched us to see if we spontaneously combusted. And we didn't, so they felt they could move forward themselves. Yes, it was quite lonely at one point, but that is very much not the case now. And breaking down those barriers, building trust and understanding between school leaders and across schools is really, really important.
And cliche, what can you do now that you couldn't do before? This much vaunted expression about freedom. And I want to ask Martyn about this a bit later, and perhaps Andrew too. But why are you suddenly liberated? Why are you suddenly free?
I think one of the biggest things for us has been looking at the picture as a whole, not just as what in my school can we do now that we couldn't do then. But if you look at the whole big picture from 2010 onwards, teaching school role, developing our own skit, having some control of new entrants to the profession, not just for ourselves, but for our trust and our alliance of schools, which is 30 or 40 schools. Being able to offer the opportunities that brings within the trust. So the pieces of the jigsaw are really coming together now. Whereas I thought of the skit and the teaching school and school A and B and C as separate entities, it also almost feels now as one organisation that are they're inextricably linked now. We've got the provision of young teachers coming in the profession, both primary and secondary. We can offer leadership training right through from ITT to MPQH. We can offer the experiences of working with other schools. all the other jobs that appear from that role that excites the staff and engages and motivates, recruits and retains. And so you're starting to build an organisation that it's not just about having a bit of freedom over the curriculum or being able to pay somebody a bit different to do a different type of job. It's actually being able to really change the structures within the whole organisation, from teacher recruitment and retention right through to the curriculum and all the other changes that we talk about. So it's much bigger than just saying, well, yes, I can do this, that and the other now. It's much, much bigger than that.
And do you get that sort of... I was talking about place leadership. I mean, do you get that in terms of where you're located? That kind of sense that educators... I talked about educators having to become civic leaders, perhaps, in more ways than one.
I think that's absolutely the case. The things we've seen in the last few weeks following the referendum vote has thrown up issues, I'm sure, for many people in this room.
What's it been like?
Actually, interestingly, the children are extremely exercised by it and by the decision that has been made. And their views are multitudinous and varied and quite often, obviously, shaped by parental views. And I think they are probably as confused and unsure as the rest of us as to what's going to happen. But it has nevertheless engaged them massively. Even on our intake day, we had 300 year sixes who, even on the minibus in, were having an engaging discussion about the referendum. That's an energy that we have to harness. And how do we keep that engagement in the civil life of Great Britain and all the other work that we do around SMSC, British values? How do we keep that interest and engagement high? Because certainly, if the topic is right and they're interested, they will engage. But in terms of a school, we send messages out to our community by every action that we do, every interaction we have with a parent, the events that we hold, the way we deal with people, the way we treat people, the way we treat their children and the opportunities that we give them. We value their children, value all of the children in the trust. We want the best for them. And quite often, all the educators in the room will know, part of our job is to help parents realise what their children can achieve as much as the children themselves. And sometimes we have to be ambitious for them while they learn to be ambitious for themselves.
Fantastic. Thank you, Lesley. Lovely to see you.
Okay, thank you.
Martyn, tell us, hello, welcome. Tell us a little bit about Outwood Grange and the Academies Trust and your take on the system. Because you're not a small trust.
No. Sir David Carter would class us as a system trust.
Okay.
So we're up in the Yorkshire and Humber, North East, East Midlands. We're quite a large trust in the sense that we have 17 secondary schools that we sponsor, be 21 schools in total sponsored by September, 23 schools that we support. We only tend to support schools which are in special measures. We think that's our job, that's our remit. It all started in an outstanding large secondary school based in Wakefield, Outwood Grange College of Technology. And we were fortunate enough to be one of the first new sponsors of MAT back in 2009, when we were allowed, having done previously NLE work, to sponsor ourselves and then sponsor a school in special measures. So we started in 2009 with an outstanding school and a special measures school, and then very slowly, and who knew at the time?
Yeah.
There was no other model. My founding CEO, Sir Michael Wilkins, went for consolidation and then growth, and it just so happens to be a model that's been successful for us. So we've grown very slowly over time. And if I take on 4 schools in 1 year, then I would think I'm doing very well. But it isn't growth for growth's sake, and I have a very simple growth strategy that just keeps me in check all of the time.
And did you consciously, when you were thinking about the growth, did you say, we have to stay in a particular geographical area? Is that important to you? Or?
Well, that's the third of my important areas. I have 3 very simple plans that I go through. One, I just simply think that parents and the children would never forgive us if our results in our existing schools went down. So if that condition's met, then I look at my second condition, which is that I must have capacity built in my organisation in advance of need. If I meet that condition, and those 2 conditions are in place, then I would say, is the geographical location of the secondary or the primary conducive to the work that we're doing in terms of clusters, primaries that only support into the secondary schools because we believe in family of schools. And if all 3 conditions are met, then we would work with the national and the regional school commissioners to support those schools. If any of the 3 aren't, we wouldn't. It's not growth for growth's sake.
And do you have a particular culture that you bring to those schools in special measures? I mean, I'm interested why...
Absolutely.
I'm interested, is it a kind of moral purpose when you were thinking about Outwood and the Trust?
Yeah.
Why special measure schools, and what do you then bring?
Well, we just believe it's fool's gold to go chasing schools that are outstanding and good and bring them into your trust, because for us, we have a very systematic model of school improvement. And it's because of that model, whether you be an outstanding school, a good school, a requires improvement school, or an inadequate school, we would still work in our model in that school. And actually, we find, if I look at my executive team now, the vast majority of them, the outstanding practitioners, have all come from the schools that were so-called in special measures. And so we can build that growth and that capacity. There's always outstanding practice wherever we go, no matter what state we find the school in.
That's important. And have you grown up professionally then in the academies world?
No, I was 14 years as a teacher, then a senior leader, acting head teacher in a standalone local authority school model. But I joined this trust in its inception in 2009. So I've been building the model since the beginning.
Okay. And do you share Tim's and the Secretary of State's? It's not zealotry, but it's a kind of, there's a sense that the future is going to be Mattised. There's a future, you know, I mean, what would you say to colleagues that say, look, it's not for me?
Well, actually, I was very fortunate that the National School Commissioner came to our annual conference in the last 2 days. And he delivered, I think, an absolutely brilliant speech. And he started right at the top by talking about it's not just about structures. It should be a shift in that dialogue. It should be about standards and structures. And I just believe that in a multi-academy trust, because you have the accountability and the responsibility, that you can work and you can collaborate in a way which is just much tighter and deeper than you can in any other system where that accountability and responsibility is shifted out into different areas where people may or may not take the best practice.
What about the CPD angle? Are you providing better CPD than you may have done in the past?
Certainly. I mean, being originally a training school and then now a teaching school for a very long time, and then doing some system work and going out, and I have to say one of the best things that we've done is in the last 18 months we've gone around all of the regions trying to support the national and the regional school commissioners, and given all of our training and all of our systems, we just give them all away for free, and I bring different people along to give that professional development, because it's good for the system and it's good for us. And just having those, as Lesley talked about, those career structures in your organisation. I mean, once upon a time, it was a reasonably quite dead man's shoes. You went up a system, you could be a head of department. If a head of department left, you might be a vice principal. If a vice principal left, you would aspire to be the head teacher. But now, you can create whatever system you like within your trust, and I have specialist teachers who stay in the classroom who are paid almost the same as a head teacher. And those two routes through to leadership now just allowed such flexibility that I'm very fortunate that in my top team of 100 people of school improvement, I think we've only ever had 2 or 3 move on.
Really?
Yeah, on all those years.
That's a credit then to your organisation.
I'd like to think so.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm going to come to the audience as well at some stage. John, not only did you hitchhike here, and that is admirable. I can imagine you in Stratford or wherever you were going, Stratford, please. But tell us a little bit about your background and your work in the Sir John Cassius Foundation. It's London-based.
Yes, and I think it's more important, Ty, to tell you something about Sir John Cassius Foundation rather than my background, which is a willingness to thumb cars down. The foundation is an anomaly in terms of those you have in the audience and on the platform, because we are in the very interesting position of being the foundation and sole trustee for 2 outstanding schools, one primary and one secondary here in London. So if you're in the London system, you'll know about any school with the prefix Sir John Cassius Foundation in its formal name. We support, but we don't control, we don't run. Whereas here I'm joined by people who run, manage, improve. So why are we here today, and why are we happy to be a supporter and sponsor of this event? I look to the words, Ty, of celebration, ambition and inspiration.
Yeah.
The you had to make it all fit the same width, but ambition is has the largest point size, if you can do such things for large words, of those three.
It is.
And our ambition is, although we're getting on for 300 years old, is still to innovate. So my colleagues in the audience, there's Tracy and Kevin, our chairman and treasurer at the back, look backwards when we need to celebrate, but we're always looking forward. So what we're here today for is to hear where you, who are driving the system change, feel that the destination is. And our question, of course, is how, as a charity, because we support capital improvements, we support revenue streams of different kinds for innovations, for project work, for research, and we can support individuals with bursaries, which makes us quite unusual, having this sort of threefold approach to funding. So we're trying to think, how can we capture some of this energy which we're hearing about in the system? Very briefly indeed, in where I come from, I have a fondness for local authorities because I was the secretary of the London Boroughs Association at a time when local authorities in London, the outer London, were obviously taking over the function of local education authorities, ILEA having been abolished, and saw at that stage that system change was bringing all kinds of liberating feeling to the professionals and indeed to the teachers in schools working in that, and get the same sense now of a sort of a system dynamic changing.
Do you think it's positive?
Well, of course it is, because people will still be able to concentrate on doing things well. The names will change, the titles will change, but the people who are attracted to teaching have good reasons for doing so. Personal ambition might be part of it, but a desire to work with the students and pupils, and I saw that when I was involved in Aim Higher here in London, across the region. Everybody I met in schools, and I had a task at, better finally end, but one of my tasks was supported by the Department for Education to try to link London's 427 that then were maintained secondary schools with its 43 higher education institutions. That involved collaborating in a way with all of them to be able to demonstrate.
Across London?
Across London. And what that showed me in a lot of being in schools and working with head teachers showed me this remarkable level of energy and commitment.
It's not only, from what I know about the foundation, so not only do you support schools, but there's a really interesting kind of grant-giving program, and that innovation that you talked about. You're 300 years on, still interested in new ways, new approaches to 300-year-old challenges.
Kevin has got all the right words, hasn't he? That's absolutely spot on, because and it isn't just schools, it's also, we're very interested in prisoner education, for example. So education in other settings
Absolutely
where we
vital.
feel, absolutely vital.
Can I turn to Andrew? And please now, don't be modest. I spent Sunday afternoon about 2 months ago, I spent a Sunday afternoon in Brighton. Had to explain to the family that I was going upstairs with Andrew. Andrew, you'll be relieved to know, was actually in Birmingham. I was in Brighton reading about Andrew's childhood and journey to school leadership. I was reading the draft of Andrew's book. And I want you to tell us, before you make a comment about the school system, I want you to tell us about that book. I want you to tell us the title. And I want to celebrate the fact that I think it's published today. It is, isn't it?
I think it's out there at the moment anyway. You can certainly buy the book.
Tell us about it.
Well, it's called The Art of Standing Out. Thank you very much for that very
I
generous
loved it. It was a
plug-in.
great afternoon. You and I shared similar memories, but we supported different football teams.
Absolutely. Well, we won't go down that route.
I obviously supported a much more successful
Clearly.
football team at the time.
Clearly.
And you were a Scouser.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you. Yeah, so the book is called The Art of Standing Out, and essentially it's the whole concept is about flipping the notion of this continual sort of treadmill that we find ourselves on as school leaders, with this obsession with getting the notion of outstanding. When I was chuffed to bits to hear that the new HMCI is already talking about getting rid of the phrase. So the art of standing out is essentially trying to find a different way, a more wholesome, a more meaningful, a more sustainable way to transform not just your own school, but the system across which you're working. So the key premise behind the book is that everything that you become as a leader and as a teacher very much goes back to what I refer to as base camp, and that we don't do enough in our schools, particularly when we set up a system, because it's really interesting to talk about geographically how these systems are set up. And I get quite fascinated about that because I have schools in Birmingham where across 5 local authorities are multi-academy trust, and it's quite competitive at the moment, and it's very hard to create a system that is truly values-based, because you know yourself, those of you that are head teachers, those of you that are working across schools in local authorities, there's often nothing more frustrating to making things change than getting a group of head teachers around a table, because we're all very, very passionate people, we're all very committed, we've kind of earned the right to be autonomous in many, many ways, and yet the whole notion, of course, of becoming a multi-academy trust or a collaboration or a federation or a group of schools is often a very different mindset. So that's the book out of the way. So thank you very much for,
Well, don't be modest,
for the plug.
Just on that, though, there were some painful times too. I'm not just talking about Sporting Liverpool, but dare I mention it? You talked about values, you talked about base camp, but I remember bloody quite hard to. Sorry, I'm swearing, but it was bloody hard to read. Your experience in the belly of the Ofsted beast was pretty horrid, wasn't it, really?
Well, it was tough. I mean, I've been an Ofsted inspector myself for 7 or 8 years, and I was quite passionate to become an inspector because I felt it was really important that we got more system leaders inside the system, you know, reforming from within. I mean, you'll know about that yourself, Lesley, and I've since stood down from the role, and you can read all about that in the book. There's a whole chapter on that. It was rather not a messy affair, but it was one on a matter of principle where I was getting increasingly frustrated about the way that the direction of travel that Ofsted was going through. So I've kind of seen it as a chair of governors, in a school. I've seen it from a parent with my own kids going through it. As a teacher, I've been through it. As a head teacher, I've been through it. And, of course, as an inspector. And I suppose within the book itself, I put in there a paragraph about if I were to tweet what the art of standing out is all about, it would be this: how to transform your school to greatness in a way that is meaningful, courteous and wholesome, but without giving 2 hoots about Ofsted. So, the original working title of the book provisionally was called 2 Hoots, but I didn't think that would perhaps catch on too much. But in some ways...
No, it's rubbish.
It is, thank you. But in some ways, I think what we need to have, whether we're running a school, whether we're running a system, is that we have to stand up and really be quite passionate about what we believe our schools to be. And I think yesterday, I had all sorts of head teachers in my mat saying, oh God, the stats results have come out. If ever there was a time for us to hold our nerve and to go back to base camp, yesterday was it. And, not to give 2 hoots. One of the schools that we've got is outstanding. We got 100% last year, level 4s. Same teacher, children who are on target to exceed, exactly the same. I'm so glad that I'm not in school today having to tell those Year 6 children that technically they've failed, So it's a difficult time for schools at the moment.
And you also, we're talking to the education leaders in the room now. You don't think that lot really look after themselves?
That lot?
Yeah, those education leaders out there, they're not really looking after themselves enough.
In what sense?
Well, in the sense of their kind of professional development, the challenges, the strains of the job.
Yeah, I got quite frustrated working within a local authority. The main school within the trust after which it's named is Victoria Park, and that was a school that I took over when it was in special measures. We transformed it to standing out, and that was where the MAC grew. So we were asked to then sponsor schools, and like Martyn, we focused primarily on bringing in schools that are in a bit of a pickle, and we support them because it's, you know, morally the right thing to do. But I was getting frustrated all the time about head teachers who were complaining about constraints and that they can't do this, they can't do that. And the freedoms are out there to do it. I mean, Sir John Dunford talks beautifully about becoming an academy. I mean, it's not about freedoms from things, it's about freedoms to do things. And it's being really clear about what it is that you can do differently.
Yep.
And I think from us as a family of schools, it's that whole, it goes back to Carol Dweck and the growth mindset. I think all of the staff and the leaders within the trust very much believe that if we want to do something, we can. And we don't have to go to the local authority and get not so much permission to innovate. I mean, that's probably doing them a huge disservice. But I think certainly as system leaders, we've got to define what that system is. And I don't quite know what that looks like. I don't quite know what it is. I mean, it was interesting to hear definitions about how these mats are growing. You know, for example, if 20,000 schools in the country, if every single school becomes a mat, and each mat is defined by just being 2 schools, technically, you could have 10,000 multi-academy trusts, 10,000 systems across the country. I think the way forward for that now is really, really challenging, and we're at I think a really serious crossroads.
Crossroads of what?
About making the right choices, because I think for schools, ultimately, to not do something collaboratively is not on the cards. I'm not suggesting that we have to go out and become multi-academy trusts, but one of the things that I found since I became a MAT, or since I became an academy, I should say.
When was that then, way back?
Well, I became an academy in 2012. It was the 2010 Academies Act that allowed primary schools to convert, essentially. And I think at the time, people just assumed that I wanted to pull up the drawbridge and I didn't want to work with other schools. I have never worked more collaboratively and gone out and fiercely built powerful networks, not just locally or regionally, but nationally, than since I've become an academy. And you have to go and do that. You have to work hard at that. It doesn't come to you easily. And when you're in a local authority school, you tend to assume that your networks are there for you. It just tends to be your local cluster, and you're there by definition. You have to go out and work at that. And my concern is that there are a lot of leaders out there that are missing out on really exciting opportunities to do just that.
Do you agree?
Oh yeah, massively. And I also think that one of the things that I've seen that as part of that sense of growth of your staff, we've been very fortunate recently that we've had, for example, our Deputy Chief Executive has gone on to take on a trust much bigger than ours. I've got other executive principals who are going on and want to become CEOs in their own right. So you can work with schools, you can grow your leaders, you can encourage them to go on and take on other schools and support other schools. And I just agree completely with Andrew there that I've never seen us collaborate with as many schools across the entire country, let alone just within the 12 local authorities that I work in since we've become a multi-academy trust.
All rosy? All utopia?
No, not always, but I always just think, rather with our profession, rather than moaning about it, just grab it, shape it and get on with it. And that's always a motto that served us well for quite a long time.
Tim's boss talks about having partnership with people that don't agree with you. or partnerships that are just not the partnerships that... And here's your partnerships. Yeah, there's the same old people that you've always partnered with. Lesley, does that resonate?
Oh, absolutely. I think getting outside of your comfort zone, away from people who think like you do, certainly in fairly rural areas like the northeast, which is quite isolated in many respects, actually having the contacts across the country in different local authorities, and actually working as an offset inspector helps with that as well. You see many different ways of doing things, and many useful things that challenge your own way of thinking about things. Absolutely invaluable, and I think that's been massively enhanced, certainly from my personal experience in the last 5 or 6 years, rather than feeling atomized within a local authority. The sharing and the professional collaboration. Teachers are sharers by nature. On the whole, they want to help educate, whether adults or children. And I think that sharing and that bringing down of the barriers is actually a privilege and a really emotional thing quite to see sometimes, how people will help and support one another in the right setting. And trust is everything. Trust and confidence.
So it's a new landscape. It's under creation. You optimistic? You talked about. I know, and you yourself say it's easy to mock, but the miracle in the East. What was that about? Was that about when John was pointing out about the font size there? You're absolutely right, by the way. I thought it was my eyesight. Is there an ambition taking hold that wasn't there before?
So the ambition that we're looking for is to harness every school you go to. People have got the ambition for their school. They're desperate to make it even better, sometimes from a really low base, sometimes from a high base, but they just want it to really work. What I think I now observe is a lot of people, colleagues here, who are now doing it across a whole group of schools. They're finding what their trust means, and they're finding new systems and structures to bring everyone up to the very best. What I think we're looking for is how do we then, across the system, bring together all those who are working together, different trusts, local authorities, teaching schools, and how do we make all of us pulling together? We all want the same thing, but sometimes we don't always pull in the same direction. How do we make sure we pull that together and harness our ambition and say, actually, our ambition is to make our whole area the best it can be. And actually, the success of one school is not at the expense of another school. And I think in a trust, we're beginning to see that, and it's about how we extend that right across the region.
So Tim, in terms of that brokerage and the glue in the system, here's the question that's always put back to you guys and others as well, is aren't you going to have to recreate something like a local authority? ...
I think it's very different. I mean, for me, I worked in local authorities for a long time, and what I observe of trusts is very different indeed from local authorities. And I think the best local authorities are recreating themselves to do something very different. I think if you talk to people like Martyn and what he's doing is not what a local authority did. When I worked in a local authority, my job was to let the best heads flourish and flower and to pay attention to the weakest head teachers. Strong trusts are paying attention to every school in their trust. They're not just disproportionately paying attention to the weakest schools and allowing the rest to go off and do the best. Okay. The best trusts, I think, are really insisting that all the schools come up to the very best standards.
Listen, we're hurtling towards coffee. What I'd like to do is just take a pause in terms of the panel, and if you're happy, go out to the audience. I know we've got a couple of lovely assistants in the room, and I think a few people bursting for questions. I think you might need to hurtle down here as well. There's two colleagues at the front. Try and keep them brief, but if you don't, I'm not going to tell you off. Well, I will, but...
Tim, question.
Who are you?
Derek Trimmer, Executive Head at Swale Academies Trust in Kent, and just beginning in East Sussex as well, so I guess a regional trust. My question is very much around, I mean, our moral imperative is very similar to yours, Martyn. We pick up challenging schools, and you, Andrew. That's what we do, that's our raison d'etre, and we're very good at it and supporting schools and still keeping their individual flavour. And Kent is interesting in itself because of obviously the selection process, and it's got 34 percentage points difference between children from different socio-economic disadvantage and backgrounds. But one of the things that I'm concerned about is when I look around, I see certain academy trusts will only cherry-pick good schools. And when we're talking about multi-academy trusts growing, what checks are there in the system to ensure that there is the recognition that it should be about supporting those schools that need the most work? And if I may just add one last thing to that. For example, one of the schools that we took on out of measures and is now good, it has cost us probably financially close to £1 million over 4 years to support that school to get it to that position, because financially the numbers within the school were not viable. And there is a significant cost. And in a meeting I was in East Sussex last week, I could have walked away with the keys to 5 schools from a local authority because they knew that they cannot afford to run these schools and they're very keen to pass them over. Now, we're more careful, much more careful, and we work very closely with other trusts, as I said. But should there not be some pressure on good trusts to ensure that the work that they're doing remains strong in terms of its moral imperative?
So you used the word cherry picking.
Yeah, that wasn't very brief, was it, Ty? Sorry about that.
It doesn't matter, I'm not telling you off. I thought it was a good question. Directed at Tim and particularly, yeah? Derek? Huh. How do you stop people cherry picking the good ones?
I think a lot of trusts now are not intimidated by school improvement, but are intimidated by the financial or the building state of schools they take on. I think part of the model that I was talking about, the growth of trusts, is to get to a stage where a trust, rather than just doing school by school, should we take this school, not take this school, all of those kind of things, we reach a position where a trust essentially is authorised through this growth process to say we will now agree a further, let's say, 5 schools over a period of time for this trust to grow. We think you're the kind of trust that looks like you're capable of taking on over time of 5 schools. Now, part of the quid pro quo that I'm quite keen we generate into that is, in amongst those schools, there's got to be a proportionate of complete basket cases. Right? So in terms of that sense of schools that really are the most challenged, not just in terms of their pupil attainment and the school improvement challenge, because I think people are less intimidated by that now than they were, but by the estate, by the financial legacy, by the sort of the state the school has got into, and some of those real
physical
challenges.
fabric, etc.
Absolutely.
Martyn, good question you were just whispering to me.
Great question. Certainly for us, we've worked with 2 of our 3 RSCs very closely, and we were given support under a Northern Sponsor Fund, a capacity fund, and very clearly that was just aimed at the schools which were causing the most concern. And if I look in the north and the eastern, where we are, then there's clearly not enough good MAT sponsors out there to sponsor all of those schools. And as I said before, I think there are certain things you need to be a really successful MAT, and I think sponsoring good and outstanding schools is fool's gold. I think you'll find the capacity in the schools that you develop and you improve, and they'll be the ones who then go on to shape your model and then actually be the next leaders in your trust, certainly. Just my last point on that one, Ty, is I don't care about the sponsorship date of any of my schools. I was just support them under an LLE contract. I don't care when they convert. We just give them at cost, because we know we'll drive up the standards, drive up the funding, and then be able to pay ourselves back. And we just then deal with the capital issues, and if they don't suit us, then we'll carry on an NLE contract until we can find a solution to the capital problem that we've got. It's about the children.
Can he come and visit you?
Absolutely. Everyone,
Great.
anyone can come visit us. Our doors are always open.
Hang on, there's over 200 people here. Be careful what you wish for.
We've done it before.
Okay, there you go. Derek first. Jill, tell us who you are and where you're from. You're a colleague from FE.
Yeah, I
Talking
feel like
about-
an interloper, actually. The word FE hasn't been mentioned yet, so it's really
Talk
nice
about
to be
stresses
here.
and strains.
Absolutely, you should be in my world. My name's Jill Scott. I'm Group Quality Manager for a group called LTE Group, which is the Manchester College, Novus, which is 83 prisons, Total People. We have an apprenticeship unit, and we're working now with Trafford College as well in the area review. So we have about 100,000 learners within the group.
100,000.
100,000 learners within the group. So I'm picking up on some of the issues, and it's really nice to hear from John. Oh, Aim Higher, wasn't it fabulous? We had Aim Higher in Greater Manchester. It was the glue that went from primary right through HE, right into employment. And what a job we did in Greater Manchester with that organisation. It didn't belong to anybody.
Which organisation?
Aim Higher Greater Manchester.
Aim Higher.
Yeah. And it was absolutely doing what we're missing. Because my question is, and I have got a question this time.
It's okay, I like the preamble, it's fantastic. No, seriously.
It's about system and beyond school. Because there's no conversation. It seems to stop, does it, when you get done the school bit?
Yep.
No, absolutely not.
Okay.
I mean, we do have young people. We have 5 pupil referral units. We have, just in the Manchester College, 5,500 young 16 to 18-year-olds. And, you know, we progress those young people through, and we also do higher education. So my question is, how can you work in a system and place when you're only thinking about schools?
Very challenging, great question. It's possibly going to be our last one as well before coffee, but quick answers to that.
Didn't quite hear the end of the question, sorry.
The question is, how can you work and lead place if you only talk about schools? And the fact is, a bit of a dearth in perhaps a lot of education debates and conversations is that we're very school focused. And you look at LTE and really it's quite an interesting construct in the sense that it's come out of Manchester College, but have almost, and if you want to look at how organisations are now responding to this new landscape, LTE is worth having a look at.
Yep, certainly. Well, we do a lot of good work with universities and colleges. So I have a UTC that we support. We work with an FE college to get them involved in that. We work with a university. Just on your table, there's also a gentleman from the Sheffield Hallam University that we work with in close partnership. And we're trying to look at teacher training across the entire North Eastern, East Yorkshire, Humber, East Midlands region. So we've always branched out. Just as Andrew said, I just think collaboration has just never been greater since we've been a multi-academy trust at all levels of the system.
John, you're both praising Aim Higher. And Jill's point was it was exactly what we need now, because partly because you were arguing it wasn't owned by anyone. It was co-owned. Okay. And what happened to it? John.
It's like all of these things, it was discovered, or at least originated with a political party, and you get a change, and the funding regime changes as well. It wasn't invented here, and between 2008 and 2011 it was run down. What it has done, and I hope that those of you might still recall, it did have wonderful centres of excellence. The Secretary of State earlier, Ty, was talking about particular needs groups such as white working class boys, and one of the centres for excellence of that was in the East Midlands region, where collaboration between schools and FE colleges and indeed other partners in the system was of a very high order. And I suppose my thought, because I'm an anomaly sitting here, I will ask Tim during the coffee break, what can happen to a non-academy trust of very small size in 5, 10, 15 years' time? That's what I'm going to be grilling you on, Tim.
And by the way, we love anomalies.
Oh, and one, are there any geologists in the audience?
Geologists?
Or even physical geographers of an old sort that used to do not physical determinism. Tim's map.
Yep.
You remember showing shades of sort of O'Donnell and blue and so forth. Did you notice that the lowest performance was across the chalk? There's a huge swathe of chalk from Lincolnshire down through Cambridgeshire. Dorset's the anomaly. The Dorset chalk seems to be doing quite well in terms of performance.
I'll be very careful with that, because the Education Endowment Foundation might fund you to the tune of £3 million to investigate the depth of chalk in school improvement and random control tiles of chalk. Lesley.
Yeah.
Happy birthday, EEF. Lesley.
I would agree with Martyn. I think links are still there. We co-sponsor a studio school with our local FE college. We've helped develop AP provision. But actually, I think the bigger issue for FE colleges at the moment is the mismatch between the new Key Stage 4 curriculum and the progression pathways to children. One of my bugbears and particular concerns, and it's partly from being an offset inspector, is what have we got as a meaningful and engaging curriculum for those children, the bottom 5 and 10% who we include in our schools, who we want to include? How do we engage those children who may not even be able to access the new GCSEs? Do we have a meaningful suite of qualifications for them that will lead into progression? I'm not sure that the answer to that is yes. And the other side, I would say, is, and this is just a bugbear of mine, it's not really linked to FE, is AP is less than good in this country. And if we really mean all of the children in all of our communities, then as a system, we really need all leaders to become involved in looking at AP provision and making sure that actually our most vulnerable children are experiencing quality, rather than the very varied picture that they've got at the minute. I think there's some real work to be done there.
Andrew, final comments as we head towards that. You can smell the coffee almost, can't you?
Well, I'll be very brief then. I think what would be useful to take away today would be to go back to the actual title of the event, which is this notion of shaping the school system of the future. And I'm really quite fascinated about what that might look like. And I'm really clear about the role of leaders in schools is that either the system will shape you and you will become absorbed into it in many ways, looking at the future direction, or the system will be shaped by you. And I would really urge you to go back to your schools and to your collaborations and your local communities and have discussions with like-minded people. Surround yourselves with people who have the same passions and views as you, and go and create a system, whatever that may look like. And good luck.
It's a cracking book. It really is. Seriously, it's one of those books. And have you noticed also there's a trend, not only educators on Twitter, but actual educators writing fantastic books about our education nation. But more importantly, what a cracking panel. Thank you very, very much. Superb.